Hi and welcome to this week's Archives of Warcraft, the series where we take a look at dungeons that have existed since vanilla at least, and look at some of the features that maybe don't have so much significance these days, but they're still there, and we have a look at what they were for back when these dungeons were run during vanilla times. So the first thing I'd like to show you is Thorium Point. For Alliance at least, if you died anywhere in Blackrock Mountain, this is where you rezzed from. You had to corpse run back all the way from here, run mind you, but die we must because I want to show you a very important NPC. So what we're going to do is basically jump off something high quite close to Blackrock Depths, somewhere we'd have to go through with our corpse, and then we're going to run back from a much closer position. Oh, we get to fly now. Such luxury. There's a rare spawn I never once saw in vanilla. In fact, the first time I saw it was a couple of weeks ago when I was doing Blackrock Spire. I suppose that's because Blackrock Mountain always had players back in it in vanilla. And in this tomb you'll find a ghost of a dwarf. He was the original architect of this spire, really. He died at its completion, and his hammer, Ironfell, went to an apprentice who he didn't consider worthy, Phineas Darkfire, who is a boss in Blackrock Depths. And he sends you on a quest. He doesn't do it now because we don't need the Shadowforge key, which is the reward from it. But more about that in a moment. He sends you to kill Darkfire, recover the hammer, and then he sends you to the statue erected in his honour to return it there, and then you get the Shadowforge key. So what do we need the Shadowforge key for? Well, if you've been through Blackrock Depths, you might have noticed a couple of gates called the Shadowforge gates. It was needed to open those, otherwise you weren't being able to access that part of the dungeon very easily. And you needed it for the Shadowforge lock. And if you couldn't unlock that, then you were very much restricted from accessing this part of Blackrock Depths. You were not getting past it at all. So you needed someone in the party who had the key. Keys were very important in vanilla, as you probably already know, if either you were from that time or you've been watching my earlier series. Now, if you've done Blackrock Depths only since the new versions of Dungeon Finder, this is probably the first boss you would kill. She drops the prison cell key. Doesn't do a lot now, keys don't do a lot, but they were very important back in the time of vanilla. This key was used to open up the prison cells where you'd find various things in there, and again, no use anymore, although there's some interesting characters. But it was used at the time for an Alliance quest chain to get attunement to Onyxia's lair. We had to break out someone called Marshal Windsor, who sulked a bit. We had to actually break him out twice, but because it's such a long quest chain, I'm going to leave that till later. So, the Ring of Law, we know this fight. It's a nice little bonus objective now, and it grants us, as it did then, safe passage through the upper area with the spectators if we want to go up that way. But here I'm plonking down something called the Banner of Provocation. I've mentioned this before. This was a quest line involving upgrading your blue dungeon set to epic. And what you do if you can plonk this down, you can't get this anymore, but it does still work, is the Ring of Law for the first part works as normal. He sends in 2 waves of pretty weak adds. But then on the final gate, instead of one of the regular bosses, you get a whole party of adventurers who come out at you. At the time, were pretty tough encounter, even for reasonably well-geared people. Obviously not for like well raid-geared people, but for well dungeon-geared people, they were it was a tough encounter. And at the end of it, you got a chest, which gave you access to a much better piece of loot, and even now gives you access to a reasonable piece of loot, you could argue. One minor boss of some note, has no significance now, is Rockor. He can drop, or could drop, a couple of items. There's the shoulders, which is actually dropping here, which are actually not too bad if you want an understated transmog. But he could also drop an enchanting pattern. I was an enchanter at the time, so I used to go for this boss a few times, that would allow you to craft a bind on pickup trinket. Now, bind on pickup meaning you can't like make it for other people, but you could make it for yourself, and it wasn't that it was brilliant, but what it did was just fit in your trinket slot at a time when there were not many trinkets, especially if you were still moving through dungeons. There were very few, quite rare drop rates, and not all of them were all that suitable. So it was just something nice to put into what would have been, for me, an empty trinket slot when I started doing dungeons at level cap. In practical terms, Blackrock Depths was a feeder dungeon for Molten Core. And this particular boss here, now I actually got this wrong last week. I said that this boss, this named boss, was in Upper Blackrock Spire. Of course it wasn't, it's here. Incendious, we used to farm him for wrist. Now you can see he always drops wrist, but at the moment they just have stats on, reasonable stats for the level. But they also had fire resistance on them then. So you would do many runs. You would probably just run in here with a party, do Incendious and run back out and reset until you got the bracers you wanted in your party with the stats you wanted, and of course the fire resistance there. But also what this was used for was crafting the dark eye material. Anything that uses dark iron bars needs the black anvil. You can't use any old anvil. And there was a lot of fire resistance gear for which you needed Thorium Brotherhood rep to be able to get to use, not all the way through Molten Core, but especially on Ragnaros, the Fire Lord, who did, of course, a lot of fire damage. And when fire resistance was a thing, you had to at least wear a few bits of kit. Used a lot of materials, some of which you could get on a very rare drop basis outside, but you'd get quite a lot of it by running Molten Core, so that hopefully by the time you got to Ragnaros, you'd have all the materials you needed. All you needed was someone who could craft it. There were very few people with the Thorium Brotherhood rep, because it took a lot to be able to get up to, say, Revered and especially Exalted. In our guild, I mean, although I was a blacksmith, I didn't have the rep. We actually had to pay someone else on the server to do that. It was very involved. Just looking at here to see if it's worth crafting any now. Just never thought about this, about the transmog. I'm not sure about boots. I don't have any boots that sort of match the set. I'm not actually sure if there are any. There may be. Might be worth having a little look at that. And there's sulphurous, of course, for which you need to craft if you want to get the legendary to combine it with the item that drops off Ragnaros. But even getting dark iron bars wasn't all that straightforward. A smelter would have to learn from one of the bosses in Blackrock Depths before you activated the encounter, this guy here, who would ask for some materials, including gold bars and star rubies, as I recall. So you'd have to run the dungeon a few times, a couple of times at least. And then you'd have to take it to the Black Forge to be able to actually smelt them. This is right at the end of Blackrock Depths. So it was no easy task to get these materials or to smelt them and then to craft them into items yourself. But of course, because these items were used for large-scale PvE, of course you would have groups that would be willing to help you through that. As well as getting patterns from the Thorium Brotherhood Quartermaster, you could also find some dotted around Blackrock Depths. You can sort of still see the scrolls now. You can't interact with them. You wouldn't necessarily know they're anything other than scenery. The only pattern you can really interact with now, as far as I know, is for the first form of the repair bot that engineers used to use, and you still need now in order to be able to make a Jeeves. And so on to the Grim Guzzler, where there's a right collection of characters, and although there are quests associated with a few of them still, you don't really fully understand what they're about always. So Hurley Blackbreath, you were sent on a quest by him, certainly from the Alliance side, because he had stolen the Thunder Brew lager recipe. So you're sent in to not only destroy any stocks he's already got, but to bring back the recipe. Ribley here, Ribley's a funny one because you're sent by his sister. Because apparently she complains that he's always spending the family fortune but now he's running to the wrong crowd and he's got a price on his head. So she asks you to bring him back, and at first, oh, isn't that nice? Some concern there. But she says, no, it's good that he's now worth something. If you can't bring him back, just bring me back his head. Another NPC, Mistress Nagmara, she doesn't do anything now, had a quest. She says she was in love with Private Rocknot, who we'll meet in a moment. And she sends you to collect ingredients for a love potion because her normal succubus charms aren't working on him, which sends you to various places, including Ashara, the older Ashari, because he can't do the quest anymore because that has been reformed by the goblins. And then, you know, you could persuade her to take him out back do a bit of snogging, which allows you to walk out of the previously closed door. Now, Private Rocknot does feature now because he is one way, it's the most common way for me anyway, at the time, to actually get out the door, because what you would do is buy some dark iron ale, 6 of them, and then feed them 2 at a time to him, and then he gets a bit drunk and decides he wants more, causes quite a lot of commotion, and then the golem, for some reason, smashes the door open and then stands in the way of it. I'm not quite sure why, but it's very helpful because we just kill the golem for some nice little gloves sometimes, or fist weapon I think you can drop sometimes, and then walk out the open door, all without causing a fuss and attracting undue attention. Finally, there's the bar manager plugger, who you could buy a couple of very desirable recipes from, but also had a couple of bits of loot if you could enrage it. So this gnome, which of course I took great pleasure in. So what you would do is steal food and drink until it became hostile, attack it, and it could drop the barman's shanker, which rogues quite like. It's also very good for transmog. It's a broken bottle. And also the schematic for the goblin jumper cables, which is not shown here. It's showing the one piece of loot that no one really wanted. And this was used by engineers to be able to res people. Like you could have rogues who were engineers who could vanish, so they use it and res a healer for white recovery. And then, of course, another way to get out of there was start a good old bar fight just by attacking people. But that was all very time-consuming and very messy, and the least suitable of the ways to get out of there. There are a number of pieces of scenery around Blackrock Depths that are attached to class quests, because we now have class quests that invariably send us to Blackrock Depths at level 50. These weren't around, certainly for most of vanilla. I'm not sure they were around at all. It may have come in late vanilla or much later on, so I'm not really going to talk about those because I can't even remember when some of these even came into the game. Now, one of the chief reasons for rerunning this dungeon was to get materials for the Arcana. Now, I've mentioned these before because you returned these at Diamol. You would find books around the world and you turn those into the library in Diamol with some materials, and you get an Arcanum, which was an enchant that you could put on your head, for example. There were a few different types of them that would add stats. And one of the materials required was a bind on pickup item in the dark coffer. So what you would need to do is to go to where the dark coffer is located. It wouldn't open. You had to find where the dark coffer keeper was and use the text to give you a clue. There are various locations around Blackrock Depths you could be. In this particular case is with the spectators around the Ring of Law. So you need to go to him. He was reasonably tough, but you know, for a party that's running it lots and lots of times, you'd be fine with him. And then you'd go back, be able to open up the dark coffer. You can still see these items now. There's a burning essence here, and there were other ones as well. Now, the 7 Ghosties was really the third from last boss if you're playing it all the way through. But for many runs that I went into that went this far in, it would probably be the last boss for a lot of people because it dropped quite good loot. Certainly, before I went into Molten Core, I found it, as every healer would have done, for the Hammer of Grace. Didn't drop on this particular one, but it was it's sort of pretty rubbish in a way, but it was the best healing hammer you could sort of get from dungeons easily. But the last boss, the Emperor, very rarely done, and the main reason for that was because it was actually quite awkward to get to. You had to pass through this room. Of course, it's quite straightforward now. But at the time, of course, we know how this works, or if you've been through Blackrock Depths and you've done this one, you'll know how it works. You have to find the guys in red, and they have a torch. You need to take the torch to each of the braziers in turn. There's 2 braziers, so you need 2 torches in total. And the mobs around here have very little health. Very little health. Even in vanilla, they had very little health. But there were lots of them. They kept shooting at you. What you really needed to get through them easily and efficiently was a mage to just bounce around like an idiot doing arcane explosion. Now, when you were having parties formed for this, and just like a lot of these dungeons, you could raid it, you could take 10 people, you would have absolutely loads of paladins who would want to sign up for it. because the last boss dropped the Lightforged gloves, which was our dungeon set gloves. But it didn't drop any other dungeon set pieces, unlike a lot of end bosses of some of the dungeons that were run for level 60s. And I think part of the problem was it starts off as quite a low level dungeon. You can sort of do it at around about level 50. Some of the bosses are even a little bit below that. But the end boss is like level 56 or something. Now, it didn't really drop a great deal for mages. And here was the problem. So paladins wanted to do it. Some other melee might want to do it as well, because it dropped a really good trinket, Hand of Justice, which is now immortalised as an heirloom. But very few mages want to do it. So you usually had to get a mage that you were friendly with, because they usually couldn't be bothered to trock through all this lot. But you did sort of need one. The actual penultimate boss is just a non-boss. I don't think it even was all that valuable at the time. Didn't drop anything of note as far as I can remember. I think when totems and relics and things like that came into the game, and Libra for paladins, I think it dropped a Librum. But that was quite late on in vanilla. Into the final room itself with the Emperor, you would clear the whole room. I mean, some of them were pulled when you pulled the boss anyway. You didn't want that. I think it was Dragoons. Certainly some of the tougher guys could drop the black dragon scale patterns, I think for the legs, maybe another piece as well, I'm not sure. This was highly desirable. Leather workers would want this because the items would sell. They were very good pieces for hunters, possibly shamans as well on the horde side, I don't know. I was lions. So you would certainly want to clear those up, and they would sell. If there was no leather worker in your party, of course you rolled for those. They could sell for quite a bit. And then the Emperor himself. Now there was a quest associated with him. You see at the moment he's got a priestess next to him. But if you look in the text in the dungeon journal, you can see that it still talks about him having Moira Bronzebeard at his side. Now he had a quest to sort of go after him from her father, who is now sort of turned into a crystal. And because it was considered that he'd kidnapped her. Now he hadn't, she was in love with him. But there was suggestion that he'd put her under a spell. So what you had to do was to pull the boss, if you're on this quest, but not Moira, so that she would stay alive. But then it turned out she actually did love him, and and she had a kid and all the rest of it. Now, of course, we know the story has advanced from there. Moira is now sort of one of the leaders of the dwarfs. But yeah, at the time, she was the one who was there, and you'd try and keep her alive if you were on that particular quest. And as I say, the Emperor, two main pieces of gear that people would want to come here for, and one was the Lightforged Gauntlet, so you would always have, you'd have a party of 10 or a raid of 10. There'd probably be 6 of them as paladins. God, it took me so long to get them. And the other one was the Hand of Justice. And although there was cloth gear, mages weren't all that bothered about it. It was nothing significant for them, which made it very difficult unless you had a guild of people who were happy to keep running it with you. Quite difficult to get those Lightforged Gauntlets. So there we are, that's Blackrock Depths. Now, of course, it's a very large instance, and there was an awful lot of other things as well. But I think I've covered everything that's still there that perhaps you wouldn't understand the significance of now. But if you think I've missed anything out, of course, put it in the comments below. Because I will be returning to Blackrock Mountain at some point in the future. But that is to look at the raid instances and the Marshall Windsor questline, but that'll be sometime in the future. There's a few other things I want to do first. So that's the last part of Blackrock Mountain for now, and next time we'll be going somewhere else. And don't forget, if you've liked it, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe, and if you don't, please comment why. And until next time, I'll see you later.